My grandfather made me promise on his deathbed that I would never tear up the floor of that barn. For 40 years, I kept that promise. Then, the buyers wanted an inspection, and under the third floorboard from the wall, I found his handwriting, dated the night a man vanished from our land. My name is Thaddeus Moreland. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent every one of those years on the same 600 acres outside a small town in rural Ohio. This farm has been in my family since 1911. My grandfather built that barn with his own hands. My father was born in the room above the kitchen, and in 3 weeks I'm supposed to sign the papers that hand all of it over to a stranger. Before I tell you what I found, I want you to do 2 things for me. First, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells me people are still listening to men like me who have more history than years left to live. Second, subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you is only the beginning, and I don't think I can carry the rest of it alone. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I'd like to know who's sitting with me while I say this out loud for the first time. I never wanted to sell. My wife passed 4 years ago. My knees don't work the way they used to, and my son moved to Columbus and has no interest in corn or cattle or the smell of diesel in the morning. So when a young couple made an offer, I told myself it was time. I told myself the land didn't need me anymore. The inspector came on a Tuesday. He was checking the barn's foundation when his boot went through a floorboard that should have held. That's when we saw it. A compartment beneath the boards, no bigger than a shoebox, built with a care that told me it wasn't rot or accident. Someone had made this on purpose, and someone had made sure it would never be found by accident. Inside was an oilskin pouch, and inside that, a notebook in handwriting I would know anywhere, the same hand that taught me to write my own name. My grandfather, Elias Moreland. The last entry was dated October the 3rd, 1961, 65 years ago, 2 weeks before a man named Cornelius Reed disappeared from this county and was never found. I sat on the floor of that barn for a long time before I opened it, because some part of me already understood that whatever was written inside was the reason my grandfather made me promise, with his last breath, never to dig here. I didn't read the whole notebook that first night. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly, and some part of me, the part that had kept a promise for 40 years without ever questioning it, wanted to put the boards back and pretend I'd never gone looking. But I'd already gone looking. There was no unseeing it now. So instead of reading further, I did something I should have done years ago. I drove into town to see Ruth Reed. Ruth is 91 years old. She was Cornelius Reed's younger sister, and she still lives in the same white house on Miller Street where she raised 3 children and buried 2 husbands. I've known her my whole life, waved to her at church, nodded to her at the feed store, but we had never once spoken about her brother. In a town this small, some silences get inherited the way land does. She answered the door herself, moving slower than I remembered, but sharp behind the eyes. When she saw it was me, something changed in her face. Not surprise. Recognition, like she'd been waiting 65 years for a Moreland to finally show up on her porch. "I wondered when one of you would come," she said, before I'd even told her why I was there. She let me in and made coffee. Neither of us drank. I told her about the floorboard, the compartment, my grandfather's notebook. I watched her hands tighten around her cup as I spoke, but she didn't look shocked. She looked relieved, the way people look when a weight they've carried alone finally gets set down somewhere else. "Cornelius and your grandfather fought over the boundary line for 3 years before he disappeared," she told me. "Not a friendly disagreement, real hatred. Cornelius used to say your grandfather moved survey stakes in the night. Elias used to say Cornelius grazed cattle on land that wasn't his." She paused. 2 weeks before he vanished, Cornelius told me he was finally going to prove it. Said he had something that would settle the matter for good, once and for all, in front of the whole county. "Prove what?" I asked her. "I don't know," she said. "He never got the chance to show anyone. He left this house on a Thursday evening to walk the property line one more time before he took whatever he had to the county surveyor. Nobody ever saw him again." Her eyes met mine, steady despite the years. "Everyone assumed your grandfather did something to him. Nobody could ever prove it, and your family never said one word about it, not once, not in 65 years. I sat with that in silence, longer than was comfortable for either of us, because now I understood something Ruth didn't yet know, that my grandfather hadn't just stayed silent. He had written it down. He had built a hidden compartment in his own barn and sealed his account of that October inside it, and then made his grandson swear on his deathbed never to touch that floor. That's not what an innocent man does. Ruth reached across the table then and gripped my wrist with surprising strength for someone her age. "You have that notebook," she said. It wasn't a question. "You read the rest of it, Thaddeus Moreland. And when you do, you come back here and you tell me what he did to my brother." I drove home with her words sitting heavier in my chest than the coffee had in my stomach. That night, alone in the farmhouse kitchen, I finally opened the notebook to the second page and read the sentence that made me understand why my grandfather had spent the rest of his life afraid of his own barn. The second page of my grandfather's notebook didn't begin the way I expected. There was no confession, no admission of guilt. It began with a single line underlined twice, like he needed to convince himself of it even as he wrote it. I was not the only one on that ridge that night. I read it 3 times before I understood what he meant. Then I kept going, and the rest of the page unraveled everything Ruth Reed had believed for 65 years. According to my grandfather, Cornelius Reed had come to the property line that Thursday evening exactly as he'd told his sister he would. Elias met him there, and the two men argued, loudly, bitterly, the way 2 stubborn old farmers argue when neither one has ever learned how to lose. My grandfather admitted to that much freely. He wrote that he'd been angry enough to consider striking Cornelius, angry enough that he was almost glad later that he never got the chance, because that's when the third man arrived. My grandfather didn't name him at first. He referred to him only as the man from the Blackwell place, a hired hand who worked a neighboring farm that had changed ownership so many times over the decades that nobody now remembers who ran it in 1961. This man, Elias wrote, stepped out from the tree line just as the argument reached its peak, and he was carrying something in his hand that caught the last light of evening. My grandfather described watching Cornelius go pale, then silent, as though whatever the man was holding meant something specific to him, something he recognized and feared. Elias claimed he didn't understand what happened next. There were words exchanged between Cornelius and the stranger, too quiet for my grandfather to hear from where he stood. And then, in the space of what he described as less time than it takes to say a man's name, Cornelius Reed turned and walked into the dark with the stranger beside him, not dragged, not forced, but walking on his own 2 legs, toward the tree line that bordered our land and the old Blackwell property beyond it. My grandfather never saw either of them again. He wrote that he stood on that ridge for nearly an hour afterward, frozen, trying to convince himself that what he'd witnessed was nothing, a private conversation between 2 men, no business of his. He went home. he told no one. And when the county came asking questions 3 days later, when Ruth Reed and the sheriff and half the town started looking for Cornelius, my grandfather said nothing about the stranger from the Blackwell place, because, in his own words, and this is the sentence that made my blood go cold, to speak his name was to invite him back. I sat back from the notebook, my heart pounding harder than it had any right to for a story 65 years old, because I recognized that phrase. My grandfather had said something almost identical to me once when I was 9 years old and asked him why we never walked the tree line at the edge of the property after dark. He'd gripped my shoulder hard enough to leave a mark and told me some names weren't meant to be spoken out loud on this land. I had thought it was superstition, an old man's strange rule for a farm boy. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen at 63 years old, I turned the page to find out if my grandfather had ever learned that man's name and whether he was foolish enough to write it down. I told myself I was only going to look. That's the lie you tell yourself at midnight when you're 63 years old and standing in your own kitchen with your coat half on, your grandfather's notebook open on the table behind you, and something pulling at you that you can't name and don't want to examine too closely. The tree line sits at the northeast corner of the property, maybe half a mile from the house, where our land gives way to what used to be the Blackwell farm. Nobody's worked that ground in years. The county records show it changed hands 4 times since 1961 and sat empty more often than not, like something about it discouraged people from staying. I took a flashlight I didn't end up using. The moon was near full, and once my eyes adjusted, I found I could see the tree line clear as day. A dark, uneven wall of oak and sycamore that my grandfather had walked around his whole life, and that I realized, standing there, I had also avoided my entire life without ever once asking myself why. The walk took longer than I expected. My knees aren't what they used to be, and the ground out there is uneven, pocked with old fence post holes from a boundary line that hasn't mattered to anyone in decades. When I finally reached the trees, I stood at the edge of them the way you'd stand at the edge of water you weren't sure was safe to enter. Nothing happened. I want to be honest about that. No figure stepped out of the dark. No voice called my name. For a long moment, I felt foolish. An old man standing in a cornfield at midnight, spooked by his dead grandfather's handwriting. Then I saw the marker. It was half buried in the underbrush, maybe 10 feet inside the tree line. Easy to miss unless you were looking exactly where I was looking. A flat stone, not natural to this soil, roughly the size of a dinner plate, with something carved into its face that the moonlight only barely let me read. Not a name, not a date, a symbol. 3 lines crossing at angles that didn't belong to any survey marker or property boundary I'd ever seen in 63 years of walking this land. I crouched down to touch it, and that's when I noticed the ground around the stone. Even in poor light, even with my old eyes, I could see that the earth there sat differently than the ground around it, slightly sunken, slightly disturbed, in a rectangle roughly the length and width of a grown man. I didn't dig. I want you to know that. Whatever else I am, I'm not a man who disturbs a grave with his bare hands in the dark, but I knelt there long enough to understand, with a certainty I couldn't explain and didn't want, that I was not looking at a boundary marker at all. I was looking at a headstone that had never been allowed a name, and as I knelt there in the cold, my flashlight still off, some old animal instinct I didn't know I still had told me with absolute clarity that I was being watched from somewhere inside those trees, and that whatever was watching me had been waiting a very long time for a Moreland to come back, I don't remember the walk back to the house. I remember my heart pounding harder than my knees could account for, and I remember bursting through my own back door like a man half my age, throwing the deadbolt behind me, though I couldn't have told you what I thought that bolt would keep out. Then I was back at the kitchen table, the notebook open, my hands too unsteady to turn the pages as carefully as I should have. What my grandfather wrote next explained the stone. He said that 3 days after Cornelius Reed vanished, when the whole county was searching the roads and the riverbank and every barn for 20 miles, Elias went looking somewhere nobody else thought to search, the tree line at the edge of the Blackwell property, where he'd last seen Cornelius walking into the dark beside a stranger. He went alone at night, telling no one, driven by a guilt he couldn't yet name. He found the disturbed earth before I did, 65 years before I did, in almost the exact same spot. And beside it, he found the man from the Blackwell place standing perfectly still, waiting, as though he'd known Elias would come. My grandfather's handwriting grew smaller and more cramped on this page, like he was trying to fit an unbearable amount of information into the smallest possible space, as though shrinking the words might shrink what they meant. The stranger told Elias his name that night, a name my grandfather wrote down once in that entry, and then never again anywhere else in the notebook, as if he'd learned his lesson about naming him. The stranger said Cornelius had gone looking for something on the Blackwell land that didn't belong to the living to find. Old bones. An old debt the ground itself was owed, going back generations before either the Reeds or the Moorlands had ever settled this county. Cornelius, digging where he shouldn't have dug weeks earlier, had disturbed something that then came looking for whoever disturbed it next. The stranger hadn't taken Cornelius. He'd warned Cornelius what would come for him. And Cornelius, understanding at last what he'd unearthed, had chosen to walk into those trees on his own, rather than wait for it to find him in his bed. My grandfather wrote that the stranger gave him one instruction that night, the same instruction he later gave to me as a dying old man without ever explaining why. Never disturb the ground past the tree line, never speak its name, and never let a moorland forget the debt his family now silently carried simply for having witnessed it. The last line of the notebook was written in a different ink, added later, maybe years later, in a hand that had grown shakier with age. It read, "I have kept my silence 40 years. I pray my grandson has the same strength when his time comes, because I fear the debt does not end with silence. I fear it only sleeps." I closed the notebook. Outside my kitchen window, past the porch light, past the edge of what I could see, the tree line sat exactly where it always had. Closer to my house, I realized now, than it had ever felt before in 63 years of living beside it. And for the first time since I was 9 years old, I understood that my grandfather's fear had never been superstition. It had been a warning I was about to inherit, whether I signed those papers or not. The first sign came 3 nights later, and I almost dismissed it the way you dismiss most things when you're an old man trying to hold on to your own sanity. My cattle, 16 head, grazing the same pasture they'd grazed for years, refused to go anywhere near the northeast fence line. Not spooked in the way cattle get spooked by coyotes or thunder. Refused the way an animal refuses something it understands, and you don't. They bunched at the far end of the pasture and stayed there, and no amount of coaxing from me would move them an inch closer to those trees. The second sign was smaller and harder to explain away. My porch light, which has burned steady every night for 11 years without so much as a flicker, began going dark for exactly as long as it takes to walk from the tree line to my back door, and then flickering back on the moment I checked it, as though something had simply passed beneath it and kept walking. I stopped sleeping well after that. I'd lie awake listening to the house settle the way houses do. Except now every creak sounded like a footstep, and every gap in the dark past my window felt like it was being measured by something patient enough to wait 65 years and could certainly wait a few nights more. On the fourth night, I called Ruth Reed. It was past 10 o'clock, an hour no decent man calls an elderly woman, but I no longer cared about decency. I cared about the truth and about the fact that I was the last living person who fully understood it. I told her everything: the second man, the grave without a name, the debt my grandfather had carried in silence for 40 years and passed to me without a word of explanation until it was too late to refuse it. Ruth was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't angry, the way I'd feared it might be after 65 years of not knowing. It was tired, in the way of someone who has finally been allowed to stop carrying a question she never got to put down. "My brother didn't die because your family did something to him," she said. "He died because he found something the ground never should have given up." "That's not the same as murder, Thaddeus. That's just this county being what it's always been." She paused. "You said your grandfather asked for silence. Maybe silence was the wrong thing all along. Maybe he should have told someone how to close it back up." I asked her what she meant by that. She told me something her own mother had once said decades before, that Ruth had always taken for grief talk and nothing more. That some ground in this county was old enough to remember being paid in blood before it was ever paid in crops, and that the dead only came looking for whoever knew about it and said nothing. I sold the farm anyway. I want to tell you I found a way to close whatever my grandfather opened, some tidy ending where an old man makes peace with the land and everything settles quiet again. I didn't. I did the only thing I knew to do. I told the young couple buying my family's home the truth about the tree line, all of it, and let them decide for themselves what kind of neighbors they were willing to live beside. They bought the farm anyway. Young people don't always believe old men, and I can't fault them for that. I've moved into town, closer to Ruth, who I now visit every week, the two of us bound together by a secret neither of our families ever wanted. But some nights, when I can't sleep, I still drive out past my old property line, and I still see that porch light flicker exactly the way it used to when something passed beneath it. And I think about my grandfather's last written words, that the debt doesn't end, it only sleeps. And I wonder, some nights more than others, whose turn it will be to keep that silence after I'm gone. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from inheriting a secret instead of an answer. My grandfather gave me 63 years on land he loved and one promise he never explained, and by the time I understood why he asked it of me, it was already too late to ask him the questions that mattered most. I think about that a lot now, how much of what we call family history is really just old fear, passed down quietly enough that nobody has to call it by its true name. If there's one thing this taught me, it's that silence doesn't protect the people who inherit it. It just delays the moment they have to face what they were never warned about properly. I chose to speak in the end, even knowing it might cost me the sale. I'd rather carry the truth out loud than carry it the way my grandfather did, alone, in the dark, for 40 years. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, do an old man a kindness and hit that like button before you go. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, the kind this land doesn't give up easily, subscribe to the channel, because there are more of us out here than you'd think, sitting on secrets our own families buried in the dirt and never dug back up.